what seems like a very simple and mundane activity just to hear it described, building a timeline in Excel, right? But there's written expression, audience awareness, complex problem solving, originality, thinking creatively, problem sensitivity, mathematical reasoning, anticipation and forecasting. What this does is it gives language and clarity to what seems like a very ambiguous activity. It makes people more mindful of the work that they're doing, and it gives them sort of scaffolding with which to think about it. When you have this new language, those are the tools of thought. So you can think about what you do in a much deeper way and start to perceive the nuances of how it comes together and how you need to improve if you want to become a master.
Welcome to the Conversation Factory. I'm your host, Daniel Stillman. I'm investigating how we create change through changing conversations. Each episode, I'll talk to an amazing conversation designer to try to distill insights we can all bring into our work and lives. You can be part of the conversation in two ways. The first, head over to theconversationfactory.com and subscribe to the newsletter to never miss an episode. That's theconversationfactory.com. The other way is to be part of the show. If there's a challenging transformation you want some help with, head over to theconversationfactory.com/coaching to fill out a survey to get 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on the show. Be a part of the show and get 30 minutes of coaching at theconversationfactory.com/coaching. Today's episode is a bit unusual. My friend Gabe Globe is interviewing me, so I'll be yapping a lot more than normal. His company, Cultivate.me, helps organizations become learning organizations by breaking jobs into skills. And we try to do this for some conversation design skills. We talk about how to break down engagements into discrete steps, tools, and triggers, how a reflective practice accumulates benefits over time, and how mathematical reasoning figures in all of this. Enjoy the episode and make sure to check out the show links for more information.
Hey there.
Hey, Gabe. How's it going?
It's going well.
This is a good thing. So it's funny that the roles are reversed here. But I'm recording this on my my handy dandy H4n digital recorder.
Oh, be still my heart. Is that a Zoom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's every penny. It's not actually that expensive.
I have really old, God, at least 15 years old at this point. Maybe 20.
I've heard that they kind of last.
They do. They make great recordings. And they're the sort of workhorse of certainly of the jazz musician industry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell me again what you play. I can't remember.
I played the drums.
Which is
it's been a while.
Maybe the most amazing of the musical skills. I would just say that because if you watch a drummer, it's just alchemical what's going on there, right? There's so much happening. They're keeping time, but they're also pushing things forward.
Yeah. So when I was in middle school, my drum instructor, who was a gigging musician in Chicago, told me the secret of being a great drumming performer. And it's two simple things. You make everything hard look easy, and you make everything easy look hard.
So it's like the
right.
Big
so you're
reach
just
back.
playing this super simple groove, and the expression on your face is one of absolute anguish, pain, and torment. And then when you blow through it's like you're just sneezing, and it's no big deal.
Wow.
That's the key.
So, here's the thing that's funny, and I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself and what you're doing with me today. But what's interesting to me, and this is a question I might have about the skills thing that you're talking about, which is that the analogy of the drummer, the drummer who keeps time but who drives things forward, that makes a great facilitator, and you are a very good natural facilitator. And it's hard to know the drumming skills. And this happens all the time when somebody says I'm great at this and that means I can be great at that. And I'm like, yeah, well, maybe. But there is always that translation. A lot of the work I'm doing now is around stuff I learned teaching origami is stuff that I'm now teaching people about teamwork and design thinking.
Yeah. That's a deep well there. So much of what I feel I get paid for in the business world these days is built around skills that I developed as a musician and a band leader and a composer, right? Certainly facilitation is one of them. I do, a lot of workshops. I get up in front of people. So, as a musician, you develop the ability to obviously get up in front of people and kind of put yourself out there and be comfortable in front of crowds. But you also learn to really gauge the energy in a room. Certainly as a drummer and in a jazz performance, you understand how to nudge in the right direction as you sense that energy changing, or you learn how to kind of ride with it, So working with groups, facilitating things like that. I could go on with, how writing a 100-page RFP response, in a proposal is not unlike composing a jazz band composition, and working with a group of VPs to get them to agree on a big solution is not unlike convincing a bunch of jazz musicians to work together. There's all sorts of transferable skills there.
The conductor analogy, yes.
Yeah. And by way of introductions, that's what kind of drives what I'm doing today and what we're trying to build is finding ways to get at those deeper sort of meta skills, if you will, those foundational transferable skills that support the more visible activities that you can do in any different particular industry or job or role or function, and finding ways to articulate them, visualize them, and help expose talent that is maybe hard to see.
So can you also just tell how you got there, a little bit of your origin story, and then I will totally hand the reins over to you.
Yeah, sure.
But it's we met through the design gym and design thinking, and you were at Pearson at the time, what you did before you were there.
Right. So it all began one stormy night in 1977. I won't go back that far. So I started my professional life as a jazz musician. I should say what I'm doing right now is I founded a company with two other partners called Cultivate Me, and we help we do sort of consulting and software that helps businesses retain their talent and helps professionals become more engaged in their work by creating a culture of learning within the organization and really embedding those kind of practices, mindsets, habits. And we're building a software tool set that is sort of the infrastructure of that learning culture, right? So how does one go from being a jazz composer and drummer to building kind of talent visualization software and doing, learning consulting? I got a master's degree in jazz composition and chased a girl down to New York who's now my wife, and realized that wasn't kind of the lifestyle that I was looking for. So somehow fell into education technology. And did a number of different things there, but felt like I had this huge kind of skill gap, right? I'm a musician. How am I going to do anything in the world of ed tech or business? And so started just trying to study everything that I could and sort of develop what I felt were going to be these new skills for business. Some of which was taking correspondence courses and direct mail copywriting and stuff like that. And I was really at sea, trying to figure out what skills do I need, what kind of role do I want, what can I do. So I was learning a lot, but really just kind of tossing about on a sea of choice. And this is, the internet was just starting to come about. Google wasn't really a thing yet, so it was a bit of a struggle. And so that was one of my early frustrations that I think I'm trying to solve right now, which is, how do I know what I'm good at? How do I know what roles out there I might be able to bring some value to? And then I also started to discover that, like I'd mentioned before, there's actually a lot of skills that I developed as a musician that can deliver value in this kind of world. Several years later, in the ed tech world, I ended up running learning and development for a sales force in North America of about 600 people. And they had just merged 5 different business units into one. And so every salesperson now had like an 80% knowledge gap in what they needed to know and understand. And I was the poor sap that had to figure out like what 80% that was, because it was different for everybody. And then deliver the right, learning experiences and materials to help them close that gap. So I had this other huge challenge of like, how do I know who's good at what? What skills do they have? What knowledge do they have? How can I map that and somehow use that to deliver more personalized learning experiences, as cliched as that sounds? And so I think with what we're building right now is a way to try and tackle both those things. So, in 60 seconds or less, it starts with a way of taking a selfie of your skills that sort of maps your mastery level across this taxonomy of 160 different sort of meta skills. Everything from communication and negotiation to self-awareness and finger dexterity and, inductive reasoning, right? And then a set of practices to help you become more mindful at work about what you're doing, which is what we're going to talk about today, and sort of accumulate data and information and self-reflection on this thing like a ball of tinfoil until you start to have this language and this knowledge and this confidence in what is your skill set, what value do you bring to the table as an organization, and then start mapping that to different activities and roles out in the world. So you can start connecting with places where you can deliver value and people can more easily kind of see and understand that.
Right. And so what we're doing is actually kind of odd because, back in 2015, I met a group of people in Australia who I was working with who called kind of the things that I was doing around design facilitation, conversation design. And I've sort of taken that on, and that was part of the things that propelled me to start doing these interviews for this podcast. And it's my LinkedIn title now, and it's an interesting conversation starter. And so now you are going to interview me about what a conversation designer does, where I may not know the answer to all of these questions, because it's a name that I've given to try and create a space around those skills and to redefine what it is that I offer and what other people offer to the world. So this is extremely meta. Just want to highlight that. And so you're going to ask me questions about what a conversation designer does, and I may or may not have any answers for them.
Yeah, that's fine. This is a process of discovery. One of the things that we've realized is that it's really hard for people to talk about their work. And what I mean by that is it's a very slippery slope into a world of abstraction. Right? We talk about kind of generalized responsibilities and sort of abstract skills, and it gets very squishy, and we can talk about it for a long time and still never really build like a clear picture in our minds of like, what does this mean day to day?
Yes.
What does this job look like?
Because a lot of jobs look the same. There's emails and there's meetings.
Right. And there's similar skills that go into that, right? There's industry knowledge that differs. But what we have been sort of discovering and refining is this framework or spectrum, if you will, of activities versus abilities. And our nomenclature is a concrete engagement versus an abstract capability. And so we try to approach a role and a position through the concrete engagements. Like literally tell me what you do all day. Right? And that's the first question I'm going to ask you is, what did you do yesterday? Right? And as you start to describe those things to me, we realize that they come in little building blocks, right? 15, 30, 60-minute chunks of stuff that you do. And then you kind of unpack or align each of those things with these abstract capabilities. So let me give you an example of a concrete engagement. This is one, I just wrote this before we got on the phone here because I just did it. So, as an example, discuss open position with a candidate. Right? So, the description of this concrete engagement is simple. It has 4 or 5 simple parts, right? So, on occasion, a new position on our team will open up, and people will reach out to me to inquire about it. I spend 15 to 30 minutes, usually on the phone or a Google Hangout, and I talk with them about it. I answer their questions, and I ask some of my own, and mostly I'm testing for legitimate interest, what they would bring to the role, and what might be some roadblocks or deal killers. And that's it. That's a concrete engagement. And the description has a few key elements, right? There's a trigger, like why do I do this or what causes me to do this thing? There's the steps, like literally what do I do? There's the tools, like a phone or a Google Hangout. And there's the time that it takes. Those 4 things will basically give you a clear visual image of what this thing is that you do. And then we align this with our taxonomy, which is visualized in something we call the iris. And so for this particular...
Which is very cool. It's a beautiful visualization.
Oh, thanks. So for this particular concrete engagement, which seems like you could toss it off as a 15-minute phone call. Yeah, I got to talk to somebody about this job. Right, but when you really get mindful about it and you start digging into it, here are the abilities, the abstract capabilities that I aligned to this one. Open-mindedness, objectivity, social perceptiveness, interest in others, verbal expression, audience awareness, feedback, problem sensitivity, critical thinking, judgment, intuition, right? There's a lot going on in that 15 or the 30-minute conversation.
Yeah.
That delivers value or doesn't, right? So we think of concrete engagements the way that a musician, going back to my roots, would think of a song, right? Like that's the context within which you can practice building your chops, as we say.
Yeah.
Right. Or an athlete would think of, a particular, like a free throw.
Yeah.
In basketball, right? That's the thing that you practice.
So the thing that's really interesting about what you've asked, and I can actually almost answer this, because when you said, what did you do yesterday? Like, I was like, oh fuck, what did I do yesterday? And the funny thing is that my calendar doesn't actually represent all of those things. So I've actually started to try and use Kanban again on my wall so that I actually have a to do, doing, and done. And it's like actually having a visual representation of what I'm actually doing is important, because otherwise I actually literally don't know what I accomplished. And so like looking at my calendar, I know like yesterday I interviewed Dave Gray, who is the author of Game Storming and Liminal Thinking, 2 books that I think you probably know about Game Storming. You may not have looked at his new book called Liminal Thinking, which is a great book. And I had this was a second interview with him because our first got cut short. And so I had to listen to some snippets of the last interview. I had to look at my, like index cards of things that I wanted to ask him the last time. What did we cover? And something that I had just learned from another podcast that I was listening to was writing down my key insights from a call, from an interview immediately, which I didn't do for the first interview. So that's why I was struggling to, a week later go through an hour of audio and make sure that the second hour of audio didn't have total discontinuities. And so that was one, I would call that a conversation with Dave Gray that I was trying to design. Right? Because I had some objectives, things I wanted to make sure I touched upon, things I wanted to tease out that we didn't get to the last time. And then there was another design to the conversation that I was using where I actually was absorbing someone else's design for the conversation with myself and my own creativity, which is like, don't wait a week before you extract the key insights from the interview. And so that is something, that was a design that I just lifted off of someone else to say, like, make sure that I don't make that mistake twice. And so just really putting that into myself. The other thing was I'm doing a workshop next week on some of the origami exercises that I do to teach people about design and design thinking and user experience design. I basically sold this workshop, and so I had to unexpectedly sold the workshop, and so then I had to in fact make a proposal to have it so it was like all verbal. Like this is something I've known for a long time, and so this was all stuff that was done over like Facebook Messenger, and so I had to solidify our agreements, right, and so something that happened that was really interesting. This is stuff that happened when like I was at the gym, and these Facebook Messenger messages came up where he was like, "Hey, so it's going to be 130 people. We only have an hour, and this is the budget. And thanks for the document you sent yesterday. I'm wondering if so I can actually read it's like." Yes. Let me try and sort this out and get back to you. Sorry for the confusion. This place can be maddeningly vague sometimes. And so he was trying to nail down a meeting for next week, and I was trying to give him a window. I was trying to like flex the price and try to understand what was possible on the pricing. And the other thing that I was trying to understand was there was an issue in the I had framed the proposal as design and communicating about design. And you and I, as design thinkers, think about design as like anybody who creates ideal circumstances from non-ideal circumstances as a designer, whereas he wanted it framed more as we're going to get 130 people across marketing and sales, design, and engineering to communicate better. Right? And so I asked him, do you need me to reformat this document to have this language in there? Or is the document sufficient? And so to me, I was trying to tease out whether I had to do more work or not.
Right.
Because I didn't want to do more work. It's not a ton of money. It's a very short amount of time. The window is small. I had a couple other things to do that day. And so I was weighing his needs versus my needs. And try to frame it as, and this is just maybe the way I approach things as a conversation designer, which is trying to make it an open-ended enough question to make sure that he could offer the information he really needed to give me, but also frame it as is this what you need? Or are you responding to, is this a want versus a need? Is this a nice to have, a must to have? And so having that framework in my mind, and I think this is something that anybody in a sort of biz dev role kind of negotiates. It's like, are we selling past the close?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm actually creating a concrete engagement right now based on what you're telling me, and I'm calling it vet workshop details for the client.
Sure. Yeah.
So I heard two things in that. I heard two concrete engagements in that. The one is when you sat down to actually write up that proposal.
Yes.
I would imagine you opened up Google Docs or whatever, and you took maybe half an hour to 60 minutes, depending on how, you've got templates for this or not.
Yep.
Right?
I adapted some templates, yes.
Yeah.
So you get another skill like adapt templates. And the other would be like have some templates, right? Because, well, no, this is something serious because I think a lot of people, some people might just start from a fresh document every time. And maybe there's an advantage to that, but I think I'm a big fan of, as a designer, I like to productize and amortize my development costs. So I think, it's not just there is like adapt template. And part of that was, is there something that I've done that's similar to this? And can I pull that up? So that's like reference library,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do the same thing, when we come up with a workshop that works really well, we want to make sure we document it. And usually we've done it beforehand. Then every time you do it, you go in and you tweak the template. Right.
Now the other thing. Sorry, no, go ahead.
Well, let's finish this thread here while we're on it. So, steps, trigger, tools, and time. Right. So here's what I've got so far. The name is Vet Workshop Details for the Client. Here's my description, and I'll finish typing as I talk here. So there's always a little back and forth with a client when we're finalizing a contract for a workshop. It happens in rapid fire back and forth, often via texting. I'm trying, let's say, I'm just going to write here and then we can go back and edit. I'm trying to make sure the client is comfortable with the details and they are, let's say, vetting the language in the document. I use, Google Docs to manage my contracts.
Yep.
And we're like, what are you trying to get to?
Well, there's an agreement. Like, so there's the classic, persona profiles. Like, what's the current state? Where do we want them to get to? And what's the gap? And so they have a need that they're trying to fill. And so I tried to understand the context. We'd already had a conversation about the fact that this is about bringing a large group of people together, having a shared communication and having a shared fun. So this is more about fun I mean, it's only an hour, so it's really not. There's some strong constraints on it, and so it's not a 3 hour or a half day workshop that's about skills, right? So the outcome, for me, it was about understanding the outcome was about connectivity and a shared experience. And so for me, it was like understand client goals.
Right.
And so part of that is like an intake interview and asking some of the questions. We're like, who are the stakeholders? What are you trying to get to? And there's a limit because I don't have the time based on the size and time horizon of the engagement to like talk to other people. I am trusting him to be the representative of the company.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So let me tell you what I've got, and then let's align it and see what kind of skills are going on. Right. So the name is Vet Workshop Details with a Client. The description, which is usually no more than a paragraph, so try to keep it at, goes like this. There's always a little back and forth with a client when we're finalizing a contract for a workshop. It happens in rapid fire, often via texting. I'm trying to make sure the client is comfortable with the details, and they're vetting the language in the document. I use Google Docs to manage my contracts, and I'm trying to get the client basically to message me saying, this looks good, I'll sign and send it back. It's probably an hour's worth of work sprinkled over a day or two.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's totally fair.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happens is once I begin to understand the scope of work and the time constraint, I actually go into Excel and I build out a timeline. And partly because this is an exercise that I've generally done with smaller groups of people. So like on the order of like 20 to 40. So doing it with 130, I need to be a lot clearer about the steps. And time is of the essence, obviously. And so I'll tell you, I did the first draft. I said, okay, I'm going to do this warm up because I like doing this warm up. And the reality is once I mapped it out, I was like, well, you're right. That does take 20 minutes. And this other part is not going to take 40 minutes. The meat of it, the thing that I promised, this activity around paper airplanes and diagramming, that will take more than 40 minutes with 130 people, like broken down. Like once I looked at what it would take to have tables of 15 process that information, I did the math and I said, oh yeah, there's no way that we can do that opening. So I did multiple revisions of you call a run of show, or some people call a TikTok.
So now I have a new concrete engagement called Build a Timeline in Excel.
Yep.
Once I close a contract on a workshop, I go into Excel and spend about 30 minutes mapping out minute to minute what's going to happen in that workshop.
Yes, I do.
Right. I'm adding...
that is my secret sauce right there.
I'm adding,
Excel.
I'll call this micro activities on each, if I can type faster, on each line. I'm estimating the time it takes for each and listing the tools, materials that I'll need.
Yep.
Right. What do you do when you're done with it?
Well, that depends. Sometimes I'll print it out and actually like have it with me. Other times I'll actually I also storyboard a lot of my workshops. So in this case, I had a pretty good idea of the story because I've done it a lot, and this is just about having precise timing. Whereas other times I will just basically draw a storyboard. So just divide up a piece of paper and just sketch out each of the things that's supposed to happen and talk about my marks. And this is a workshop where I'm not counting on having slides, so it's really just about what am I going to say and what's going to happen at each moment. Right. The other issue is there's going to be multiple facilitators helping run the room, and so I especially wanted to be precise because I want to be able to communicate a run of shows so that these 4 or 5 people who've never seen this before know what's supposed to happen at each moment, and I will have a call with them on Monday where I go over what's supposed to happen and when.
Okay. So now we've got 2 concrete engagements.
And by the way, I will also have to sell them on that arc, right? I will have to make sure that they not sell them because they don't have to buy in, but they have to understand the narrative that's supposed to happen. Otherwise, they're just going to be. It's like there's an old joke about like, are you writing a haiku or are you just counting syllables?
I've never heard it put that way, but that's a great expression of the sort of, I don't know, can't see the forest for the trees, or that's not quite. But yeah, I get it.
That's a Tick reference. I don't know if you were a Tick fan at all. That was
The Tick?
The Tick. There was a comic book and a cartoon show and a poorly done live action show.
No, I didn't see any of them.
No.
But I was bitten by ticks many times growing up and going camping, so that's as close as I can.
I'll accept that.
Okay. So listen, let's so the concrete engagements, like actually building them live, can take a lot of time. We've discovered it's unrealistic to expect to map out an entire role like in 60 minutes with somebody. But let's take these two that I've written. I'm going to share my screen with you.
Oh, cool.
And I'll align them to the iris, and you can watch, and where I'm getting it wrong, you can correct me. And then let's zoom the camera out, and I'd love to talk more at a more rapid fire pace about kind of the different concrete engagements that make up your life and your work. Maybe just your work. We don't have to get that deep.
Okay.
Can you see my screen here?
I can.
All right, so we're going to go. So this is the concrete engagement I just wrote. Build a timeline in Excel. Right? Once I close a contract on a workshop, I go into Excel and spend about 30 minutes mapping out minute to minute what's going to happen in that workshop. I'm adding micro activities on each line. I'm estimating the time it takes and the tools I'll need. Once I'm finished, I might print it out or storyboard it. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to go rather quickly through these because I know the iris fairly well.
Yes.
And if I add something that seems wrong, or if you see me zip by something, let me know. But let's see, I would say not a lot of self-control involved in that. Not a lot of persuasion, diplomacy. This is all social stuff. It's not a very social activity. Let's see. So for the people listening to this that can't see it, I'm kind of
I'm taking some screen caps just because
it's
fascinating.
Yeah, I'm stepping through our taxonomy here. Written expression, maybe, right? You want to be able to read kind of your notes.
So you're analyzing vectors of this skill, which is like there's not one type of intelligence. There's multiple vectors of intelligence. You're saying like building a timeline in Excel is about there's storytelling and there's being quantitative and there's because I know a lot of people who do this in Word. And I found that Word just doesn't have enough math in it. You know, if I change something, I want everything else to change. And so that's, that I have a quantitative bent, I guess.
Yeah. I would say maybe complex problem solving, right? I mean, like there's a lot of moving parts to this, and trying to figure out how to, sort through them.
Yes.
Might be something. Let's see here. Originality, thinking, I would say like originality, thinking creatively, like you've got to probably, let's say, I don't think imagination so much. Problem sensitivity is probably a big one. Right? Kind of estimating when something could go wrong.
Yes.
Speed and closure, mathematical reasoning.
There you go. I think there's totally mathematical reasoning in my sense of workshop design.
Okay, right. Tell me why.
Well, because I think some people, as a conversation designer, I see some people just have magical thinking about certain things. Where they're like, this is going to take 7 minutes, and that's going to take 4 minutes, and this is going to take 9 minutes. And I'm like, no, everything takes 5, 10, or 15 minutes. Or 30. And you see this with, people who need to estimate the size of stories in an agile sprint. Some people are like, I don't know, is that small, medium, or large? It's like, you should be able to know. And so I think there is some mathematical reasoning to just like look at that and say, okay, let me put a real number to that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I'm certainly guilty of thinking I can do more in the workshop than I really can.
Yeah, and that's fine if you lack the mathematical reasoning to have an accurate perception, then you need to make up for it on dynamic strength and
trunk strength.
Yeah, you need to use the trunk strength this year. It's like, so you need a little bit more intestinal fortitude to make through. Like you can just bare knuckle it and change things on the go, and that is a skill as a conversation designer. What you talked about as a musician, being able to actually sense the energy in the room, I think is a skill. And I don't know where that is in the iris, but I think there's some people who can perceive the energy of what my mother would call the group field.
What's the group field? Oh, just the energy in the room, kind of the...
Yeah. Like, if you've ever meditated with like 100 people, it's different than meditating by yourself. If you're singing at a karaoke bar, it's different than singing in your shower,
right.
If you are at a stadium concert and everyone is like has their lighter up, you can feel it. It gives you chills, right?
Yeah.
Only if you're into the music, right? Like if I'm not into the music, then I can't feel that.
Right.
So that I think there's some people who are just insensate to that. And there's some people who are highly sensitive to that. I don't know what that skill is. But I think that is a very important skill of a conversation designer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the jazz musicians' lingo, at least, is what's the vibe, right? The vibe in the room,
right.
Kind of being able to sense that.
Yeah.
And we have some social skills that I would have to find them here, but things around empathy, audience awareness, intuition, things like that. So here are the skills for those listening at home.
Yes.
That go into what seems like a very simple and mundane activity just to hear it described, building a timeline in Excel, right? But there's written expression, audience awareness, complex problem solving, originality, thinking creatively, problem sensitivity, mathematical reasoning, I would say anticipation and forecasting, tolerance of ambiguity I put in there because I mean, I've done this a little bit too, and you're kind of hacking away at it in bits and pieces, starting at the end, going into the middle, until it starts to come into focus a little bit. Learning strategies, huge thing there, right? That's really what you're doing. Documenting and recording information, processing information, time management, scheduling, judgment and decision making, prioritization, being detail oriented. What this does, I think, maybe I should ask you what you think it does before I say it. But what this does is it gives language and clarity to what seems like a very ambiguous activity. It makes people more mindful of the work that they're doing, and it gives them sort of scaffolding with which to think about it. Right? So the Eskimos have 50 words for snow.
Right.
They can have a really great conversation about snow that you and I can't because we only have one word for it. But when you have this new language, those are the tools of thought. And so you can think about what you do in a much deeper way and start to perceive the nuances of how it comes together and how you need to improve if you want to become a master of your profession or your role.
And I agree with that. Like part of like the experience of going through this is like, oh wow, I'm smart. That's cool. Like these are a lot of things that I do, and so that feels nice. But then the flip side is I'm wondering about the like, this is like the syllables versus the haiku. Like looking at all this stuff and the gestalt, it's not like you can just go get all of these skills and then go do it. Like you only learn by doing it. And so in a way, that's my question is like, because I think you had something where it's like, beginner, intermediate, advanced. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you look at all these skill components, you could look at building a timeline in Excel and you could be like, okay, I understand now. I can give it a try. And you'll go use it and you'll be like, oh God, that didn't go so well. Or you'll struggle. It'll take you longer to do it. Whereas, so where is that in the iris between like being I understand the skills involved and I can bang and I can like maybe throw something together given versus like Daniel who can be like, it's kind of like this. And it's right the first time.
Right.
If I may flatter myself. Hey, this is Daniel. we're about at the halfway point, so this is a great time. You might want to get up, stretch your legs, and get some popcorn, fill up your soda. Also, head over to theconversationfactory.com and sign up for the newsletter. Stay in touch. I'm always trying to extract some best practices from these interviews and make some great tools, turn them into PDFs to share with you. And those are things I send to my subscribers. So make sure you head on over to theconversationfactory.com, sign up for the newsletter, and stay in touch.
That's, well, I've worked with you enough to know that's the case. It's a really good question. I think I would approach it in two ways. One is sort of it's about the journey and not the destination. And the second is the way that the iris rolls up, right? So I'll start with the first. What we've discovered is that the value of the iris and the practices and the tools that we're building is not in getting to this point where you're like, oh, I get what I'm good at, right? This is the value I bring to an organization, and my mastery levels are accurate. That's a nice kind of outcome, but it's really about the process of becoming more mindful of the work that you do and building what we call the pause into your routine, daily, weekly, monthly. The pause meaning just, stop and reflect. And so we actually have a tool here which is sort of the core action of this, if you will, called reflections. And it's just what you would think it is, right? You can just write a simple reflection about your work and then align your reflection to the iris, to any of these skills. So after you have this conversation with the client about vetting the details of the workshop, or after you finish building a new timeline in Excel, or after you deliver this new workshop that you've never delivered before, right? You could sit down and ask yourself, how did that go? What worked? What didn't? What might I do differently? And, or you could sit down at the end of every day and just say, kind of, today I learned, right? I do this all the time, like when I'm out and about, having meetings, at coffee shops or being on the subway, like I'll get these kinds of aha moments, like, I gave my elevator pitch this way and it really worked well. Or I keep stumbling over this particular thing. You want to document it some way, right? So that's the process part of this in how you start to uncover what's really beneath the things that you do and what are the real skills, and you start to become more in touch with where you are in reality with those different abilities.
Yes. So what's really interesting about that for me, and this is very cool, is when I think about conversation design, I have a framework that I've been using, which I don't know if I showed you, where I think about, it's almost like the Johari window, if you're familiar with the Johari window of what's known to you, what's unknown to you, what others know and what others don't know about you. And the things that are in the Johari window that are known to others and known to you are things that are open. The things that are known to others and not known to you are your blind spots, for example. Right. And I actually did an exercise recently with a friend of mine where there's like a list of maybe 50 characteristics, and you print out 2 copies and you and a friend basically check off characteristics. And I get to see, me and Carl, where do we agree that what Daniel thinks he is what Daniel shows that he is, and so there's this inside and outside aspect of things, and with conversation design, I think does the kind of conversations that we're talking about right now is me designing a conversation for a group of people, right? Using my conversation design skills with a person to understand their needs and their desires for that group of people so that those people can have an organizational impact, right? And so the idea is like this group conversation that I'm designing is going to impact the organizational conversation over time. And so there's 3 conversations that are happening between me and the representative of the organization, right? My trust that he represents the needs of that organization appropriately. My ability to design with those needs, to execute on those well, so that that group can have a great experience, so that the organization can have a transformation. And so there's a series of internal and external conversations. What this is interesting about is that I do believe that there is an internal conversation design and also a lack of internal conversation design when necessary. So Dave Gray and I were talking about this. Sometimes you need to stimulate or pump gas into your own internal creativity. And other times you need to meditate or get bored or stop doing things. Right? And what this is a linking the internal and the external conversation you're having with your skills. Like, that's how I would look at this through the lens of conversation design, is that like you're asking me, the Iris is a framework for me to have a more robust, thorough, detailed, beautiful, and joyful conversation with my skills. And then to match my external experience to my internal experience. And what you're asking with the reflection is to, like, I don't know if these are specifically tied to skills, if the reflections are like tagged to skills, but to me, like, that's an interesting level where you're like, my external skill and then my internal reflection about them, so that I could sort of like go through my Iris and start to look at my reflections over time.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way that you put it. I think it's very accurate. It's a platform on which you can have a conversation with yourself, right, about the work that you do and about your ability to do that and about the frictions and tensions that you experience in that process. And so it creates a space in which you can kind of constantly identify and refine and smooth out those frictions, ideally. Going back to this actually dovetails nicely into the second answer I had to your question a few minutes ago, which is, every one of these reflections, every one of these concrete engagements that you write and that you align to the Iris is like another piece of tinfoil on this ball of tinfoil that starts to build. And so if you're reflecting, every day, if you're writing a concrete engagement or two every day, after a few months, you have this really rich, robust, I hate to say the word, like data set, but just collections of...
Why do you hate to say the word data set?
It sounds so much colder than what I think it is. I think artifacts is probably a better word, right? Like, that shoebox of memories that you have, right? That you can open up and kind of go through and take a sort of even higher level sort of meta pause, if you will, and say, oh, wow. This is how I've been growing over the past few months. This is what I've been struggling with. And we're at the place right now, it's still very early days for us, where we're trying to create ways to, visualize that in a meaningful way that gives you an interface to access those kinds of insights more intuitively, discover things where you might not think to look for them. And also maybe measure them a little bit more objectively. So every single one of those things is going to be tied to some ray in your Iris. And so after 3 months, you'll be able to say, like, oh wow, I've written like 75 reflections on reliability. Like, not only am I aware that reliability is an issue for me, but I can see kind of the patterns of me struggling with reliability, of attempting to overcome it. I can see the specific engagements of my work that reliability is tied to, and where I might be struggling with those engagements because of my challenge with reliability. And then I think the conversation, when in the work that we're doing with clients, this goes beyond the self. So you mentioned the Johari window. I think that's great. We have one of our core practices is called the Iris meeting. And that's where you meet with a peer and you talk about what's going on at work. You do it once a week. It takes maybe 15 to 30 minutes, right? And so what's a tension that you're feeling at work? Well, I'm struggling to communicate with a client on this issue. Okay. Tell me why you think that's happening. Tell me what you're going to be doing this week where that's going to come up. And let's come up with a simple commit of how you're going to try and overcome that, or something you're going to research about that, or something you're going to experiment with. And then write some reflections about that over the week. right? And then let's come together again next week. So it's a conversation with yourself, but also with your team, your colleagues, that starts to engender like psychological safety, that starts to build, that's the learning culture, if you will.
Yeah.
That we're trying to establish.
And the consistency aspect seems to be like where you get the benefits from it. And, when I coach people who are going through challenges at work, if I'm coaching them as a conversation designer, the very first thing I ask them, and I might send you, there's a document on my site where it's like I go through these 9 core conversations, and the first one is like, do you have time to think?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't if you've ever read The Artist's Way, or David White's The Three Marriages. There's this idea of the internal conversation. And I'm like, if you are not doing your morning pages
mm-hmm.
and having some sort of a reflective practice, it's very, very hard to excel or even maintain. And whenever I have a struggling time, like I don't do my morning pages all the time, and when I feel like I'm getting off my center, it's always like time to get back to the morning pages, because if you need to have that internal reflection. And this seems like, if people can use it often, they will get benefit from it. That seems to be the case.
It's a way of calibrating your psyche, right? Like every day you go through and you have experiences. Some of those experiences are great. Some of them are awful. And your subconscious is processing them whether you know it or not. And you need a way to kind of make meaning of all that. And that's what Morning Pages does for me, right? It kind of exhumes those things that I'm worried about or that I'm excited about. And it calibrates me the way that yoga calibrates the body,
Yes.
But listen, I want to do this thing with you that we still haven't done after 50 minutes. So. Sorry. No, that's fine. It's
fine.
I'm
reverse interviewing you too much. I'm the worst.
I'm happy to talk. I could show you baby pictures all day, so to speak.
Oh, that's right. We didn't even talk about that.
Well, no, I mean, like, I'm pretty much showing you baby pictures right now.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, not of your actual baby, but like... I'm not going to tell your wife what you just said.
But
does Gabe know which is the real baby and which is the code baby?
I have many babies. So let's do this. We've kind of established a little bit of a lexicon and a framework of thinking about your role. Let's kind of, in rapid fire, I want you to tell me like what you do. What are the concrete engagements of your work as a conversation designer? And let me frame it in these 3 buckets. And you can veto these buckets. Tell me if they're accurate.
Sure.
But I suspect there are 3 main buckets to what you do all day, and that you would group your concrete engagements. One is what I would call like the performance itself, right? Is like getting in the room with people and having the conversation. There are probably different kinds of conversations. Some of them are with, a few hundred people. Some of them are with a couple people, but there's probably a few different engagements in that bucket, right? The other is probably preparation. Like, what do you do to get ready for those conversations? And what do you do to kind of process them once you've finished them? The kind of lead up and cool down time, if you will.
Yep.
And then bucket 3 is probably like the business aspect of it, right? How do you ensure the fact that you are going to have conversations and people will pay you for it? Is that a fair assessment of like 3 main areas? Would you add any? Would you change those?
So preparation, right, for the work. The doing of the work, which is, and that's we could argue that this is an artificial designation because the preparation, the means are the ends, but yeah, I think that's fair. There's the preparation, there's the doing. Is reflection not part of that as well? Like the sort of like
I don't know. Let's dig into
it.
But
that's fine. I mean, because I think there is sort of like, oh, how did that go? Did that go well? And then the business model aspect to sort of pricing, productization, platform building, lead generation, funnel design.
Yeah, Facebook Messenger with the client to finish, finalize the contract, all that stuff. So let's start with the first bucket. What would you say are the 3 to 5 top kinds of conversations that you tend to have? Or design, I should say.
For the preparation?
So when you're in the room having a conversation or facilitating a conversation, what would you say? Like that's the thing that goes on your calendar, right? It's go time. I'm meeting with the client. And we're doing.
Yeah. So when when I teach interviewing, I talk about like there's like active listening. That's like a skill I use, right? The other is pushing for stories or asking for specifics, right? So there's the skill of there's an interviewing skill that we're using now that you're trying to ask me, like, what exactly do you do? Or you say like, okay, well, here's this general answer. Oh, thank you for that general answer. Like, I'm wondering if you can give me a more specific answer. And doing that in a way that doesn't sound like a dick move. It's like I can see that you're avoiding the question, or wow, you're a really high level thinker, and are you full of shit? Or, do you in fact know what you're talking about? Can you please be more specific so I can know if you are a total liar? Like, this is what's going on in my head and your head all the time, right? When you talk with somebody, you're like, can you just tell me exactly what you did? Right? And so that is a finesse question to try and get to those details without seeming invasive, right? So active listening, pushing for specifics in a way that is tender and loving, right? And also, when I teach interviewing, and I think this is something that I only the brave use, which is silence as a specific tool, right? And so silence is not the same thing as listening, right? Like, obviously, you're supposed to be silent when you're listening, which is something I'm sometimes bad at. But when somebody stops talking, there's this natural desire sometimes to like ask the next question or to fill the silence. And so, in the same way that, and I don't think I've ever thought of it this way, in the same way that I expect there to be gaps or lulls in my personal conversation of my creativity. I can't squeeze all of the creativity out of my brain all the time. I have to sleep. I have to rest. I have to be bored. I have to daydream.
Right.
And so when somebody gives me an answer to a question, I can then immediately go to my next question, or I can actively listen and dig in some more. I can ask them for specifics, or I can actually just shut up. And what's really interesting about just not saying anything is that I don't know what's going to happen.
Are we doing this right now?
We're doing it right now. Right. We're doing it right now. And so silence is a really interesting tool to use as a pause. And it takes it got a little uncomfortable there for a second, and you just try to ride it out. So that's something, as I think, as a conversation designer, to really actually positively use silence is something that is a risk and a reward.
So let me ask some mundane specifics then. When you have these conversations with the client, how long do they typically last? Is it an hour? Is it a whole day? I'm sure there's a variety, but give me the
oh yeah, well that's another aspect of conversation design, which is like the time scale, but also the periodicity. Right. So this is at least the way that I think about it. Like, obviously the conversation that I was having with this representative of this client over email, Facebook Messenger, 2 different emails, like, cause I had his, my email, my personal email, where I had to and then move it over to my work email and Facebook Messenger. Like, this is like there's a lot of cadence. There's a very different cadence on Facebook Messenger than there is on email, right? So is that a conversation? I don't know. These are short little moments of communication that I'm designing. But then there's, this hour workshop that I'm doing. There's also like this 30-minute call that's going to happen on Monday before the workshop on Tuesday, right? Which I'm also going to have to do some thinking about to make sure that I have an agenda that is worthwhile. What's fun about this call is that I didn't have to create the agenda for this. I just get to be fully present. And so there are some of the interviews that I'm doing for the podcast where I am bringing cards and thinking about a structure. And sometimes I'm just bringing cards that have some questions. And there's some that I've done that have nothing but there's something I think I'd like to ask you about, which is this, right? And so there's like a big spectrum. And yeah, so hour, half day, a full day, a 2-day workshop, a 3-day workshop. And then there's the question of some of the work that I do with the Luma Institute, where can this 3-day workshop be reutilized by multiple people in multiple locations over an extended period of time? And how often does it need to be redesigned? How durable is the design for this conversation? I just heard from a coaching call that I did this morning that it's that there's a group at this one company that's doing it in the Philippines, and they're like, it's really hard to get some of the materials, and the spaces are different and the cultures are different, and so this way that you guys are doing it in Toronto and New York and Vancouver and Atlanta is not appropriate for Manila and Bangalore.
So if we were to limit this or define a certain set of conversations by the conversations you are paid to have, right?
Yes.
The thing that's in the contract that says here's what you're getting money for, ostensibly. Right?
Yes.
It sounds to me like there's probably 4 or 5 different kinds of those if you're measuring by length of time.
Yes.
Right? There are 1-hour workshops, there are half-day workshops, there are full-day workshops, and there are, let's say, multi-day workshops.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
That's one category with which to kind of group and think about these. It sounds like there's a whole other set of conversations that are part of that second bucket of ways that I interact with people leading up to the thing that they are paying me for, right? Whether it's a quick back and forth or it's something to talk about.
Yes and no, because as a conversation designer, one of the reasons why conversation design is an interesting term to use instead of design facilitator is that a design facilitator, and I've had people ask me this, which is like, hey, we have this 1-day offsite. Can you help run it? We have an agenda.
Right.
And then that is the question of can I go play somebody else's Hamlet, right, for money? And the general fact is no, I'm not a facilitator where I can just go in with someone else's agenda. I actually have to design it. And so it's part of a longer arc. So while I'm I understand this perception, and I've had it myself, where it's I'm getting paid to design, to be in this room, but in fact, I'm being paid to understand the need, enact an intervention, and then to monitor the result. Now, sometimes the perception of value is the day is where the value is, but a lot of the work that I do with Luma, there's a lot of coaching calls that happen afterwards. And so now the value gets extended because the coaching calls, not every company wants to do the coaching calls.
Interesting.
Right.
So if we were to think about it in terms of modality,
yes,
there would be, let's say, physical in-person workshops where you work with a group of people versus virtual one-on-one or small group coaching.
Yep. Sure. Totally.
So talk to me a little bit about the concrete engagements you have outside of conversations leading up to those. So I heard things we looked at 2 already. There's, writing an agenda.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of processing the needs of the organization. There's designing I guess I kind of said this, the Excel worksheet, itself. So tell me a little bit more about, let's say, the solo work that you do preparing to have this conversation.
Right. Am I designing slides? Right. Am I designing an agenda? What kind of collateral needs to exist? So, are there templates that I'm going to be handing out that are going to be printed? So I know how to use Illustrator and InDesign. Those are sometimes useful. Those are not always useful. Most of these things can be done in PowerPoint. You can look at the templates from some companies and you're like, ooh, those are designed. And sometimes you can look at them and they're like, oh, those are boxes with words on them. And that's, and both, and you know what? They're all just fine. So yeah, those are some things creating that collateral, like a leave behind. Is there any kind of booklet? Is there a digital touch point that they engage with? This is something that obviously Luma does really well that I don't do. They have a digital platform that has all of their tools on it, and then you can subscribe to it. And so that's something that they have built as a conversation that people can have on an ongoing basis with their tools that a solo conversation designer like myself that does not, I don't have that type of scale. Similarly, there's other companies that don't have that or do have that. IDEO has a lot of resources, and the D School has a lot of resources that are on the website, on the internet for free, right? And so they have a very, a different relationship with their collateral. And so some people control their collateral a great deal. Other people put it out Creative Commons in the world. So yeah, these are business decisions and collateral creation decisions for sure.
Interesting. So like, I guess it never really registered with me which is ironic because I do, to a certain degree, I do a lot of this myself. The prominence of collateral in what you do, right? Whether it's finding it or it's designing it or it's producing it and making sure that it's either shipped or it arrives on time.
Yes, and this is something that Luma does really well, is they send a Pelican case to any place in the world filled with all the things you would need for a workshop, including posters and Post-it notes and Sharpies and sticky notes. Now, that said, I love doing workshops with nothing more than a whiteboard and some markers, right? What I would call like naked facilitation, stripping it all down. But it changes the tail, where the tail of the work is from, I do less of that pre-work and I just rely on them to have some basic supplies. And then it's more about what happens in the room versus Luma has a lot of care that they give before, during, and after the workshop. They've designed that conversation to a much higher level and allows them to monetize their conversations in a very different way.
So if you were to ballpark the percentage of, so you have X number of hours in a day, X number of days in a week, X number of weeks in a month. What percentage of your time would you say is devoted to those 3 or 4 buckets, however you want to look at it? So let's say, let's say the actual deliverable to the client of the workshop itself, if we're just saying workshops or coaching conversations, the work that's done preparing and leading up to and designing those conversations and interactions, and then the kind of biz dev work that you do to keep that stream of work coming your way.
Yeah. So one of the things I love, I've been working with Luma for like about a year and a half, and one of the things that's great about working with them is that they do all the biz dev. They have a great platform. They send all the materials and have a pretty stable set of designs for the 2 to 3 day workshops that I do for them that are of 3 or 4 different types. And what's great about that is that it reduces the amount of pre-work that I have to do. And so the touch points are minimal, where I have to connect with my co-facilitator inside of the organization, or another Luma instructor, and align with them, and then run the workshop and then do some follow-up. So it is one of the things that's great is I do 1 or 2 of those a month on average. And that is very they've designed it to be pretty fluid for the facilitators of the work. And so for that, you could draw a spider diagram where it's very, very little biz dev, no biz dev, a little bit of client engagement on needs and customization. But that's only a couple of hours. Whereas this work that I'm doing, with this other group, I have to do all of those other things. Right. But I also do a little less of collateral creation because that's just my own personal preference, is for, less collateral and my own work. So yeah, those are 2 very different types of work.
Interesting. So if I were to try and bring it back to the original intent of this, which is well, we could argue if this is the original intent or not, but what I find fascinating is what are the core skills of a conversation designer that have to come to bear to be successful at this. It's really, looking at it through the lens of the iris, it's a very well-rounded skill set, right? There's socialization and language and communication that is a huge part of the biz dev, the workshop design, the interaction with the client leading up to it, and then of course the sort of main event, right? That's very, very high on the kind of socialization, language, and communication.
Yeah, and so you said something before which I loved, which was assessing the organizational needs, I think maybe was what you said. And that is definitely something that I do, and it's a very interesting skill. I don't know where I think that may come from having a pattern library of organizational, maladies and healths. And so I don't know where, like, and actually one of the reasons why I enjoy this model of conversation design is that conversation in organizations is a different thing than design thinking workshops and work and room facilitation, but there are relationships amongst them.
Right. Well, but there's also, going around the iris now, there's a tremendous amount of cognition that happens too, right?
Yeah.
Of taking that stuff that you've gathered through your socialization and your communication abilities and making sense of it, right? Using deductive and inductive reasoning, creativity, to put it into the right kind of structure or framework that's going to deliver something of value. And then there's the kind of raw productivity and research of, building a timeline in Excel, of creating the materials and the handouts in the situations where you have to do that. Like, it's an incredibly well-rounded skill set. The only thing that you don't really hit on as critical skills are in the sort of physical and sensory area that we have.
I'll be honest, like the physical demands on a human being to be 100% on for 3 days straight is actually non-trivial. I think there's a minimum health requirement to be able to do this.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Good shoes, and I have to make sure that I jog in the mornings and get a lot of sleep and don't eat crap. That is actually non-trivial.
Yeah, and I think if we would have dug into the concrete engagements of the workshops themselves, that really would have come up. Things like stamina, right? Well, this was fascinating for me. I appreciate you opening your world to me for a little while to dig in and look at it through my own lens.
It's a really interesting experience for me too.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabe. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, thanks. And we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please check out my other episodes at theconversationfactory.com/podcast. If you want to join the conversation, don't forget to check out theconversationfactory.com/coaching to sign up for 30 minutes of free coaching that I might use on a future episode. That's theconversationfactory.com/coaching. Thanks so much for your fine attention, and I'll see you next time.